All right, happy Friday, everyone. So today we are continuing to talk about protists. We are on Unit 2, Lesson 2, and I want to take some time to go over what we already know about protists and their characteristics, but also the three categories that help set protists apart from one another. So we only want to focus on the first 4 vocabulary words here: protista, gamete, spore, and algae. So the rest of these words will come later in the lesson when we start to talk about fungi. So to start, what are protists in the first place? So protists are part of the kingdom Protista. And if you remember, this kingdom is part of the domain Eukarya. So within the domain of Eukarya, we have plants, animals, fungi, and then protists. Protists have their own very diverse kingdom as kind of a catch-all because they aren't quite animals, they aren't quite fungi or plants. They have some similar characteristics, but they're different enough that we give them their own kingdom. So one thing we can say about all eukaryotes, plants, animals, fungi, and protists, is that we all have a nucleus and organelles. So remember, archaea and bacteria from the last lesson were prokaryotes. Prokaryotes had no nucleus and no organelles. So all of these organisms, whether they are single cells or multicellular, they all have a nucleus and organelles in their cells. And again, some of these organisms are just single cells, and they look like bacteria or maybe like archaea. But remember, the difference is that these guys do have a nucleus and bacteria do not. So when we're talking about protists, they often move using these special methods, these special parts, essentially. And those are flagella, cilia, and pseudopods. So let's take a look here. Cilia are like these little hairs that are around the paramecium, and they kind of act like little fins to push and pull the paramecium through the water. So protists are typically found in watery habitats like rivers, ponds, lakes, that kind of thing. We can also see them using something that's called a pseudopod or a false foot. So amoebas move using pseudopods, and the pseudopod reaches out kind of like a leg or an arm. It reaches out and pulls the amoeba through its environment. And these pseudopods can actually be used to trap food as well and kind of act like a mouth surrounding other organisms. Finally, they can move using something called a flagellum. So you can see this here in the euglena. A flagellum is this long whip-like tail, like a long fin that flips back and forth and helps the euglena to paddle through water. Also, protists all reproduce, but some of them reproduce sexually and some reproduce asexually. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. So before we move on, let's look at some pictures of movement when we're talking about protists. Here on the top right, we have my favorite GIF, lunchtime for an amoeba. So these are the amoeba's pseudopods. And again, they're like these long arms or feet that help reach out and pull an amoeba along. But as you can see, it can also be used to trap and consume its food. So here the amoeba has trapped a paramecium. There. So that's going to be lunch. So that's our pseudopod. Next, over here, we have more of our parameciums. These are using cilia to move, and it's kind of hard to see, But look around the edge of the paramecium, you can kind of see these little hairs moving back and forth. Those are its cilia, helping it to paddle through water. And then last, we have our euglena over here. And you can see it looks like it has two flagella out the back. They're kind of clear. They almost look like hairs, but you can see that they're whipping back and forth to help the euglena swim through water. So that's what those three modes of transportation look like in our protists. Okay, continuing our characteristics of protists. Like all living things, protists need to reproduce. Some of them reproduce sexually and some asexually. So let's start by explaining sexual reproduction. So if you remember, when we're talking about any organism, in sexual reproduction, we need two parents. And each parent needs to produce something called a gamete. So a gamete is a sex cell. In humans, the gametes that we produce are an egg from a female and a sperm cell from the male. So in humans, sperm and egg cells are our gametes. So imagine our protists also need to produce their own form of gametes so that those two can come together and make an offspring. So in humans, the woman contributes the egg, the man contributes the sperm. Those two gametes combine to form an embryo. So same thing with our protists. Here we have two paramecium cells. And in their sexual reproduction, each paramecium is going to make a gamete. And those two gametes combine to make the offspring. So that is sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, protists can reproduce two different ways. Some reproduce using binary fission. So you can remember that from our last lesson when we were talking about archaea and bacteria. Basically, binary fission is a fancy way of saying cell division. So in asexual reproduction, we could have a protist that copies its DNA, it makes a new nucleus, new organelles, divides, pinches, and pop, we get two new identical protists through binary fission or cell division. But we can also see asexual reproduction through something called fragmentation. So take a look at this picture over here. And just as a side note, starfish are not protists. They are animals, but I really like how this image shows what fragmentation means. So bear with me there. So in fragmentation, take our starfish here. If an arm of the starfish breaks off, that starfish will eventually grow it back and it will be whole again. But this little piece that broke off can actually regrow an entire new starfish body. So that is fragmentation, when a piece breaks off of the living thing and then grows into a whole new organism. So with protists, that's another way that they can reproduce asexually. A piece breaks off and then grows into a whole new organism from the parent. One parent, one offspring. Another thing to note is that some protists can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Sometimes they go through cycles where they reproduce asexually, then the next time they reproduce, it's sexually, then the next time they go back to asexually, it flips back and forth. Don't worry about the details of that process for now. The important thing to remember is that some protists reproduce sexually, some reproduce asexually, and some can do both. And finally, my last slide for today, the things that make protists different from one another. So there are a lot of similarities between protists. They are all eukaryotes, they all have a nucleus, they all have organelles, they use energy to grow, they reproduce. But there are some things that make protists different from one another, and that's focused on how they get their energy. So if we think about different organisms in the world, some are consumers, they eat other living things to survive. Some are decomposers, and they break down dead things to survive. And other organisms make their own food. They're producers. So that is how we divide our protists, based on how they get their food, how they get their energy. In the first box here, some protists are consumers. Like animals, they eat other living things in order to get energy. For example, an amoeba will surround and digest another living thing, like a paramecium, in order to get its energy. So that's why we say that some protists are animal-like. They're not exactly animals, but because of the way that they get their energy, we say that they are animal-like. They act like animals. A lot of animal-like protists also move using pseudopods, cilia, or flagella. Our fungus-like protists, just like fungi, are decomposers. They break down dead things to get their energy. So an example here is water mold. You can see it in the picture there. This is a fungus-like protist that breaks down dead organisms in order to get its energy. Another cool thing that fungus-like protists can do is create something called spores. So imagine spores as almost like seeds. So if the conditions aren't right for the fungus to grow, for example, maybe it doesn't have any dead stuff to break down, that protist can make spores that just kind of hang out in the environment, and they wait for the conditions to be right for them to grow. And then they can grow. But they can survive, not really living, just kind of like seeds, waiting and waiting to grow until there is food sources available. So that's pretty cool. And when we start to talk about fungi in general, later on in the lesson, we'll come back to this topic of spores. Finally, we have plant-like protists. Again, they are not plants, but they are protists that act like plants because they get their energy from the sun by doing photosynthesis. They are producers. So as you can imagine, in the cells of these plant-like protists, we'll see chloroplasts and chlorophyll. A lot of them are green. They use the sun's energy to do photosynthesis and make food. So there are single-celled plant-like protists. There are also multicellular plant-like protists, like green algae. You can see in the picture here. But again, they are not plants, but they act like plants because of the way that they get their energy. So that is where we will wrap up today. And for your assignment, you are going to be finding, using the book and my video and the class notes, 3 characteristics of each category of protists. And that's what you're going to write in the class notebook online. Thank you, guys.